I woke up that morning to the sound of gurgling pipes and the kind of hollow silence that usually meant something was very wrong. When you live in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA and presided over by a Karen who believes she's the unofficial queen of property rights, you learn to notice patterns. And that silence? It was the absence of water pressure. I turned the kitchen faucet, and instead of a steady stream, I got a wheeze of air, followed by a dribble that looked more like spit than water. At first, I thought it was a city issue, pipes burst, maintenance, whatever. But then my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Mike, across the street. "You got water?" Karen bragging on Facebook about handling things for the HOA. Something smells fishy. That was when the absurdity clicked into place. Karen had been pestering me for weeks about my rain barrels. She hated the way they looked against the side of my garage. They cheapened the neighborhood, she'd screeched at me during the last HOA meeting, as though my green barrels collecting rainwater were somehow lowering the value of her house with its tacky plastic shutters. I thought it was just idle noise, the same kind of micromanaging venom she spat about everything from mailbox paint to how long kids' bikes sat in driveways. But cutting off my water? That was escalation, and even for her, it was insane. I marched outside to check the curb box by the street, the one where the shut-off valve sat under a steel lid. The dirt was freshly disturbed, a little mound that hadn't been there yesterday. My gut clenched. Someone had tampered with it. I crouched, popped the lid, and sure enough, the valve was cranked hard to the off position. Whoever had done it didn't even bother to hide it well. That level of stupidity had Karen's fingerprints all over it. I stood there, staring at the dry metal, half furious, half amused at how far she was willing to go. The kicker? Just as I was turning the valve back on, Karen herself came striding down the sidewalk, arms crossed like a general surveying a battlefield. She was in her usual uniform, yoga pants stretched too tight, a pink visor that hadn't seen sunlight since 1997, and an expression of smug righteousness. "Don't you dare touch that," she barked, her voice loud enough for the nearby dogs to start barking. The HOA voted to cut off unauthorized water storage. It's for the community's good. Conservation. Conservation. The word nearly made me laugh out loud. This was the same woman who ran her sprinklers in the middle of a rainstorm, who power washed her driveway twice a week. "Karen," I said, keeping my tone as dry as the pipes in my house, "you don't run the city utilities. You don't have the authority to touch this." Her smile was tight, almost twitching with the effort of holding back pure glee. "I spoke with people. Important people. They agree with me. You're wasting resources. The HOA bylaws clearly state." I cut her off, because I've read the bylaws, every tedious page of them, and I knew she was bluffing. "Karen, the HOA doesn't control municipal water. Turning off my supply is tampering with infrastructure. It's a crime." Her eyes flickered for just a second, the tiniest crack in her confidence, but then she doubled down. "Well, maybe the city will thank me for bringing it to their attention. Maybe you'll thank me when your yard isn't overrun by mosquitoes from those barrels of yours." I didn't bother arguing. People like Karen aren't convinced by facts or logic. They thrive on confrontation, on winning by sheer persistence. Instead, I just gave her a slow smile, turned the valve back on, and walked away while the water hissed back into my pipe. Her face was priceless, like a balloon losing air. She wanted me to scream, to fight, to give her more material for her HOA gossip page. Instead, I left her standing there, fuming. Inside, I turned the faucet again. The rush of water filled the sink, strong and clear. But something gnawed at me. Karen had crossed a line, and if she felt emboldened enough to tamper with city property once, she'd do it again. People like her don't back down, they escalate. And if she wanted a war over water, I was more than prepared to outlast her. Sure enough, by evening, another text pinged from Mike. "She's ranting online about community justice. Careful, man. She looks unhinged." I peeked out my front window, and there she was, stomping across her driveway with a clipboard, yelling at another neighbor about proper irrigation standards. Her husband, a shadow of a man who rarely spoke above a mumble, trailed behind her with a garden hose like it was some kind of weapon. I almost pitied him. Almost. The night ended with a knock on my door. I opened it to find a folded letter taped to the frame, stamped with the HOA logo. Inside was a violation notice, declaring that my rain barrels violated aesthetic guidelines, that I was to remove them immediately or face fines. The kicker was the signature, Karen herself, as acting compliance officer. She wasn't even on the compliance committee. That was when I knew the game had shifted. This wasn't just about water or barrels. This was about power, about her desperate need to control something, anything, in her life. And I wasn't going to hand it to her. The next morning, I installed a small camera by the shutoff valve, a little motion-activated thing I'd picked up online. Cheap, discreet, and exactly what I needed. If she tampered with my supply again, I'd have proof. Then I went about my day, deliberately cheerful. When Karen passed me on her morning walk, I gave her a wave and a smile so casual it practically dripped with indifference. It drove her nuts. By mid-afternoon, the camera caught exactly what I expected. Karen squatting by the curb box, twisting at the valve with a pair of pliers like she was performing surgery. The sheer audacity of it nearly made me laugh out loud. I downloaded the footage, tucked it safely into a folder, and waited. The long game was in motion. What Karen didn't know, and what I was just beginning to savor, was that water has a funny way of making its own path. And when you mess with someone else's supply, sometimes the pipes have a way of answering back. I didn't have to set her up. She was setting herself up. She just didn't know that within hours, her own basement would be filling up like the Titanic, while I sat comfortably upstairs, sipping a cold glass of water she thought she'd stolen from me. Karen's confidence was always her greatest weakness. The morning after I caught her red-handed on my camera, she strutted across her lawn like a queen who'd conquered a new province. She had no idea her little water escapade was immortalized in high-definition video, complete with her muttering to herself while cranking my shut-off valve like she was auditioning for a plumbing show. The absurdity of it nearly made me spit my coffee. But instead of confronting her, I tucked the footage into a safe little folder on my hard drive labeled Karen Crimes. I knew I'd need it soon. The funny thing about battles with neighbors is that the less you do, the more they panic. I kept my head down, my smile steady, and my barrels exactly where they were. And sure enough, Karen came knocking again. It was noon, and I was mid-sandwich when her shrill pounding rattled the door. "You've been issued a second notice," she announced when I opened, waving a stack of papers like she was serving me court summons. Her face was red, and sweat shone on her temples. "You have 72 hours to remove the barrels, or you'll be fined $100 per day until compliance is met." "Karen," I said, deliberately calm, "you don't have the authority to issue fines. That's the HOA treasurer's job." "I'm acting under emergency provisions," she snapped. "Emergency provisions for rainwater?" Her lips thinned. "For neighborhood aesthetics. It reflects poorly on the community when passers-by see that." She gestured at my barrels with disgust, as if they were radioactive waste instead of plastic tubs catching rainfall. I leaned against the doorframe and studied her. Behind the bluster, there was something frantic in her tone. She needed me to react, to yell, to take the bait. Instead, I nodded. "Noted. I'll keep this for my records." I gently took the paper, closed the door, and went back to my sandwich. That evening, the next escalation arrived. I noticed my hose line, which connected to the back spigot, had been severed clean through. Not chewed, not frayed, cut. The precision screamed Karen. My motion cam hadn't caught her this time, since she was clever enough to sneak around back, but I didn't need evidence for this one. The act itself was proof of desperation. I replaced the hose, adding a locking attachment this time. Then I sent a group text to a few trusted neighbors, including Mike. "Keep an eye out. Someone's tampering with outdoor water lines. Likely HOA drama." Within minutes, replies poured in. Turns out I wasn't her only target. Another neighbor reported his sprinklers mysteriously shutting off. Someone else found their bird bath mysteriously drained. Karen was running a full-scale water crusade. The best part? Her own lawn looked like scorched earth. She'd been too busy meddling in everyone else's supply to keep her grass alive. The once over-fertilized, manicured carpet was now streaked with brown patches, like a bad dye job. The irony was delicious. But Karen wasn't done. She craved escalation. On the third night, around 11 p.m., I was woken by a sound, metal clanging, then a rush of water. I bolted outside with a flashlight. There she was, crouched by my curb box again, but this time, something had gone wrong. A thin geyser of water was spraying from the pipe, soaking her in a misty arc. She shrieked, fumbling with her pliers, trying to force the valve closed again, but instead she'd snapped a joint loose. I didn't say a word. I stood there with the flashlight beam trained on her, letting her feel the weight of silence. She looked up, hair plastered to her forehead, mascara running, like a raccoon caught raiding trash cans. I was inspecting, she stammered. Routine HOA inspection. Routine inspections usually don't involve breaking city pipes at midnight, I replied. Her eyes darted everywhere, searching for an escape route. You'll pay for this, she finally spat, before stumbling back across her lawn, drenched and humiliated. By morning, her mistake had become the neighborhood's problem. The broken joint caused pressure fluctuations, and half the block reported issues with their water. A city maintenance truck pulled up by noon, workers digging into the street, shaking their heads at the damage. And who was hovering nearby in her visor and track pants. Karen, arms crossed, blaming me. He's been abusing the system, she declared to the workers. Collecting water illegally. Overloading the supply. This is all his fault. The city employee, a wiry guy with a sunburned neck, glanced at me. Sir, have you tampered with the shutoff? No, I said plainly. But I have video. I pulled up my phone, opened the folder, and hit play. The footage of Karen twisting the valve played loud and clear. Her voice muttering about justice for the neighborhood filled the air. The workers' eyebrows shot up. Ma'am, you're aware this is city property? Interfering with water lines is… She interrupted, her voice shrill. Lies. That's doctored footage. He's framing me because I uphold standards. But the damage was done. The workers finished repairs, left her sputtering on the sidewalk, and told me quietly, if she keeps this up, we'll escalate. This isn't minor. That night, Karen retaliated in a new way. I came home to find a handwritten flyer stuffed in my mailbox, copies littering the block. Dangerous neighbor, it screamed, accusing me of stealing water, endangering children with stagnant mosquito breeding pools, and sabotaging HOA unity. Her flair for dramatics had officially gone public. Neighbors weren't buying it. A couple of them dropped the flyers off at my door, rolling their eyes. One even muttered, "She's lost it. Ignore her." But I didn't ignore her. I knew people like Karen don't stop until they implode. They need to be nudged, encouraged to dig their own graves. The nudge came in the form of a storm. 3 days later, rain rolled in heavy, the kind that soaks the ground in minutes and turns basements into swimming pools if the drainage isn't right. I'd reinforced my sump pump earlier in the season, so I was set. But Karen? She'd been fiddling with water lines for weeks, blocking and rerouting drainage in her obsession. And as the thunder rolled that night, I stood at my window and watched her yard transform into a shallow pond. By midnight, the pond had seeped to her foundation. Lights flicked on in her house, shadows of frantic movement across the blinds. I could practically hear her panic through the rain. She'd tried to cut off my water, and now nature was serving her a flood. It wasn't Titanic yet, not by a long shot. But I knew where this was headed. And the best part was, I hadn't lifted a finger. The storm didn't just arrive, it slammed into the neighborhood like a personal vendetta. By midnight the rain had become a roar, hammering the roofs, pounding the streets, turning the curbs into rivers. My sump pump hummed like a loyal soldier in the basement, steady and strong, keeping the water at bay. I had prepared months earlier, after reading about the county's drainage issues, and invested in proper equipment. Preparation, after all, is how you survive in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA tyrant. Across the street, though, Karen's house was already showing signs of distress. From my window, I saw water pooling against her foundation, crawling up her pristine flower bed. The solar lights she had arranged in perfect symmetry flickered as if mocking her. She hadn't maintained her sump system, too busy sabotaging other people's water to look after her own. It was poetic, really, how her obsession with control was now slipping right through her hands in liquid form. Around 1 a.m, I saw her silhouette pacing behind the blinds, then the unmistakable shape of her husband lugging a bucket. They were trying to bail water, by hand, in a downpour that showed no mercy. Every few minutes, the porch light flicked on as they dashed out to dump the buckets, only for rain to soak them to the bone before they could even empty the load. I sipped my coffee and marveled at the irony. But Karen wasn't one to admit defeat, even to nature. By 2 a.m., she was outside, umbrella in one hand and phone in the other, screaming into it. I could hear her voice carrying across the storm, high-pitched and frantic. "This is an emergency. The HOA must take action. My property is under attack." I nearly choked on my drink. Under attack. From rain. She had the nerve to call it an HOA emergency. As if Mother Nature herself had broken a bylaw. The next day, bleary-eyed neighbors gathered to assess the aftermath. The storm had left yards soggy, but most homes were intact, except Karen's. Her basement windows were stained with muddy streaks, a clear sign that water had surged inside. A faint smell of mildew already lingered in the air. And yet, there she was on her porch, clipboard in hand, summoning anyone who would listen. "Attention!" she barked as we shuffled past. Due to the negligence of certain neighbors, her eyes darted straight to me. "Our community's drainage system has failed. We will be levying emergency assessments to cover damages. This is a collective issue." Mike, bless him, didn't let it slide. "Karen, the city maintains the drainage, not the HOA. And last I checked, you were the one fiddling with valves and pipes. Maybe check your own handiwork before passing the hat." Karen's jaw tightened. She waved her clipboard like a sword. "Defamation. Lies. I've done nothing but serve this neighborhood, and now I'm the victim of sabotage. I know exactly who's responsible." She meant me, of course. She wanted someone to blame, someone to point at while her basement reeked like a swamp. And she was desperate enough to drag the HOA into it. That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called, on her porch, naturally, because she claimed her basement was unsafe for entry. Half the neighborhood showed up, some out of morbid curiosity, others because they were tired of her antics. I stood at the back, quiet, letting her put on her show. She started with theatric. "Friends, neighbors, allies. Last night, my home was nearly destroyed. My basement filled with filthy water. My possessions ruined. Why? Because of one man's reckless disregard for community safety." She pointed a trembling finger at me, her visor barely containing the fury in her eyes. A murmur went through the crowd. Some people glanced at me, curious. Others rolled their eyes. I raised a hand. "Karen, are you suggesting my rain barrels somehow redirected the storm into your basement?" "Yes," she shrieked. "Your illegal water storage has altered the flow. It's science." The treasurer, a quiet woman named Denise who had clearly had enough, spoke up. "Karen, that's not how hydrology works. Rain falls from the sky. It doesn't migrate from barrels across the street." Karen's face flushed crimson. "You're defending him? You're all blind. He's been plotting against me for months, cutting my lines, undermining my authority. And now my home, my beautiful home, is a disaster zone. That was my cue. Calmly, I pulled out my phone and projected the video onto a small portable screen I'd brought, just in case. The footage lit up the porch. Karen crouched by my curb box, wrench in hand, muttering to herself while turning the valve. Her voice, clear as day, "Justice for the neighborhood." The silence that followed was glorious. Neighbors stared, some covering their mouths to hide smirks. Mike let out a low whistle. Denise crossed her arms. Karen lunged forward, flailing. "That's fake. He's using deepfakes. Don't you see? Technology can do anything these days." But the damage was irreparable. The neighbors had seen her, heard her. They knew. The HOA president, a retired teacher named Harold, finally spoke. "Karen, this is serious. If you tampered with city utilities and it contributed to last night's flooding..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You could be liable." Karen erupted. "You're all conspiring. You've been against me from the start. I will not be silenced." She stormed off into her house, slamming the door so hard the porch light flickered. The meeting dissolved, neighbors muttering among themselves. Some were amused, others disgusted. A few even offered me sympathetic nods. Karen had exposed herself, and though she didn't realize it yet, her reign was crumbling. The next morning, I caught a glimpse of the true fallout. A city inspector's truck pulled up in front of her house. 2 men in uniforms knocked on her door, clipboards in hand. She came out blustering, waving her arms, but the inspectors didn't flinch. They pointed at the curb box, took photos, measured, and scribbled note. Karen's voice rose higher and higher until finally one of them cut her off with a sharp hand gesture. She froze, lips pressed tight, as though she had finally realized she wasn't dealing with neighbors she could bully. By evening, another storm rolled in, not rain this time, but official letters. Word spread quickly that Karen had been cited for tampering with municipal property. A fine was likely, maybe worse. She was livid, stomping around her yard with her phone glued to her ear, no doubt calling every lawyer in the county. And yet, while she scrambled to save herself, her basement told another story. The stench of mildew spread across the block. Neighbors walking their dogs wrinkled their noses as they passed. A dehumidifier hummed constantly in her window, struggling against the damp. And Karen, who had prided herself on being the perfect example of suburban order, was now the cautionary tale. For me, it was vindication. I hadn't lifted a finger to sabotage her. I hadn't touched a single pipe. All I'd done was protect myself and let her spin her own rope. The Titanic was only beginning to sink, and she was standing proudly on deck, insisting she was still the captain. But storms don't care about pride, and I knew the next rainfall would bring the real collapse, the one she couldn't talk or bully her way out of. The next storm rolled in with the kind of timing that made me believe the universe had a wicked sense of humor. The sky darkened mid-afternoon, a bruised purple curtain hanging low over the rooftops. The air thickened, heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind carried that metallic scent that meant the heavens were about to open up. I had just finished checking my own sump pump. Believe me, nothing sharpens your paranoia like watching your neighbor drown her own basement, and poured myself a glass of water when the first drops tapped against the windows. By nightfall, the storm wasn't tapping anymore. It was pounding. Sheets of rain hammered the streets, water sluiced down gutters in roaring torrents, and thunder cracked so violently the windows rattled. I sat on my couch, lights dimmed, sipping calmly while outside the neighborhood was transformed into a scene straight out of a disaster movie. Across the street, Karen's house was already losing the battle. I could see her porch light flicker in the distance, the front yard shimmering like a shallow lake. She hadn't fixed her drainage since the last storm, too busy playing victim and shrieking about HOA conspiracies to actually repair the damage. Water poured down her driveway like a river, rushing straight toward the basement windows she had bragged were up to code. I didn't need to step outside to know what was happening inside her walls. Around 9 o'clock, there was shouting. Even over the storm, I could hear her voice, shrill and panicked, as she bellowed at her husband. From the shadows of my window, I caught glimpses of chaos. Her husband lugging buckets again, slipping in the downpour, nearly dropping one. Karen herself appeared with a flashlight, waving it around wildly, her visor plastered to her hair, screaming at him to move faster. It would have been comical if it weren't so tragically predictable. The water was merciless. Within an hour, it breached her basement windows, gushing in like a faucet turned wide open. The faint glow from inside her basement flickered, then went dark. She had lost power down there. The Titanic metaphor wasn't just apt, it was literal. Her basement was sinking fast, and she was standing on the upper decks, clinging to denial like a lifeboat that wasn't there. Of course, Karen being Karen, she wasn't going to take this quietly. At 10 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find her soaked through, mascara running, her clipboard somehow still clutched under one arm like a talisman. Her husband lingered a few steps behind, looking like a man who wished the storm would just carry him away. "This is your fault," she shrieked, jabbing a finger at me. Rainwater dripped off her nose. "Your barrels have diverted the flow, redirected the storm into my property. I demand you help me fix this immediately, or I'll have you arrested for criminal negligence." I raised my glass of water slowly, deliberately, and took a long sip. "Karen," I said, calm as a monk, "do you hear yourself? You're accusing me of controlling rainfall with plastic tubs." Her voice cracked, part rage, part desperation. "Don't you mock me. You've been sabotaging me for weeks. You and your cameras and your lies. My basement is ruined, my furniture destroyed, and you sit here sipping water like a smug little." Her husband coughed quietly, trying to rein her in, but she shoved him aside. "You'll pay for this," she screamed. "The HOA will see to it. The city will see to it. I'll sue you for every dime you have." I simply shrugged. "Good luck with that." And I closed the door in her face. Through the peephole, I watched her stand there for a few stunned seconds, sputtering in disbelief, before stomping off back into the deluge. Her husband followed, head down, clutching that useless bucket like it was a shield. By midnight, the neighborhood had gathered at their windows to watch the spectacle. Karen's basement was no longer just flooding, it was a disaster zone. The smell of wet drywall and sewage seeped into the street. She had tried laying towels at the base of her doors, but the rain laughed at towels. The water had risen high enough that her car, parked too close to the house, was now half submerged at the wheels. The final humiliation came around 1 a.m., when a fire truck pulled up. Someone, maybe Karen, maybe her poor husband, had finally called for emergency help. Firefighters in rain gear waded into her yard, hauling out pumps and hoses. Karen followed them around like a foreman, shouting instructions, insisting the whole neighborhood's safety depended on saving her basement. The firefighters ignored her, their expressions a masterclass in practiced indifference. One of them eventually told her to step back, his voice flat with exhaustion. The pumps roared through the night, and by dawn, the storm eased into a drizzle. The firefighters packed up, leaving behind a yard that looked like a battlefield and a basement that still reeked of defeat. Karen stood on her porch, arms folded tightly across her chest, staring at the soggy ruins of her empire. Her eyes were wild, red-rimmed from sleeplessness, but I knew better than to expect gratitude or humility. People like her don't learn from collapse, they double down. Sure enough, by that afternoon, she was back at it. Flyers reappeared in mailboxes, typed in bold fonts. "Neighbor endangers community with hazardous water practices." She accused me of hoarding water, of creating artificial flooding patterns, even of endangering children with toxic runoff. The fact that her basement was still drying out, fans whirring audibly from every window, didn't slow her campaign one bit. But here's the thing, her credibility was gone. Neighbors rolled their eyes, crumpling the flyers without reading them. Mike even taped one to his trash can with a note that read, "Recycle responsibly." The HOA board, weary from weeks of her drama, began ignoring her emails. And the city inspectors, already armed with footage of her tampering, had started their own process. I kept quiet, patient, watching from the sidelines. The long game was working. Every move she made dug her deeper into the hole she had created, both figuratively and literally. Her basement was a swamp, her reputation a punchline, and her composure fraying like wet cardboard. Late one night, I saw her standing in her driveway, staring at the water stains on her foundation. For once, there was no yelling, no clipboard, no audience. Just Karen, alone, her shoulders slumped, her face twisted in something that looked suspiciously like fear. It almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. But sympathy wasn't part of the plan. She had turned off my water, sabotaged my property, and spread lies about me. She had brought this on herself. And as far as I was concerned, the Titanic had only just begun to sink. The next storm was already on the horizon, and I knew it would finish what the last one started. The question was whether Karen would go down quietly or drag the entire HOA into the abyss with her. Either way, I was ready. The week after the firefighters pumped Karen's basement dry, the neighborhood carried on as though nothing had happened, except for her, of course. She couldn't let it go. While the rest of us cut our grass, washed our cars, or simply enjoyed the break in the weather, she stormed up and down the street, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tight it looked painful. I caught her glaring at my rain barrels more than once, muttering under her breath like she was summoning the HOA gods to strike me down. By Wednesday, her new plan had emerged. A thick envelope appeared in my mailbox, stuffed with legalese printed on cheap paper. Across the top it read, "Cease and desist." According to Karen, my rain barrels were in violation of HOA bylaws, municipal code, and, this was the best part, federal water management statute. She had cobbled together phrases stolen from Google searches, mixing them into one incoherent threat. At the end, she declared that if I didn't remove the barrels within 48 hours, she would pursue litigation and seek damages for property destruction. I laughed out loud. Damages? For rain. She was essentially threatening to sue me for clouds forming above my house. Still, I tucked the letter away. I never throw out my enemies' mistakes. They tend to come in handy. The next day, an emergency HOA hearing was called in Harold's garage. Harold, the HOA president, was a patient man, but I could tell even his reserves were running low. Folding chairs were set up, neighbors shuffled in, and Karen took center stage like a prosecutor in a courtroom drama. She had a stack of binders, color-coded tabs, even a laser pointer she borrowed from her husband, who looked half asleep at her side. She started with theatric. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you not only as a homeowner, but as a defender of this community's safety. For weeks, my property has been sabotaged by the reckless and unlawful actions of one individual, my neighbor, who insists on hoarding water, violating our bylaws, and endangering our families." She jabbed the laser pointer at me as though the beam could pierce my skin. Harold rubbed his forehead. "Karen, let's keep this civil. What exactly are you proposing?" "I am proposing," she said dramatically, "that we vote to levy immediate fines against him, compel removal of his illegal water tanks, and file a collective lawsuit on behalf of the HOA for damages sustained during the storm." The neighbors exchanged glances. Some stifled chuckles. Mike leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the show. Denise, the treasurer, raised her hand. "Karen, we've been over this. The HOA doesn't regulate municipal water. Your basement flooding wasn't caused by barrels. It was caused by poor drainage on your own property." Karen's face flushed crimson. "How dare you? You're colluding with him. This is corruption at the highest level." I stayed quiet, letting her dig. Then, when the murmurs grew loud, I stood. "If I may." All eyes turned to me. I pulled out my phone, scrolled, and displayed the cease and desist letter Karen had stuffed in my mailbox. "Karen, did you write this?" She lifted her chin. "Of course. It's a legal document." "Interesting," I said, "because it cites federal water management statutes that don't exist." In fact, most of this letter appears to be plagiarized from Wikipedia. And since you've put this in writing, signed it, and distributed it, it's technically harassment. Possibly even mail fraud. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Karen sputtered, pointing the laser pointer at me like a sword. He's twisting things. He's always twisting things. You don't understand the threat he poses to us all. Harold had had enough. He banged his hand on the folding table. Karen, that's enough. We're not voting on this. The HOA is not your weapon for personal vendettas. This meeting is adjourned. Neighbors stood, some shaking their heads, others whispering. Mike clapped me on the shoulder as we filed out. She's unraveling, man. Just sit tight. Nature's got your back. He wasn't wrong. That night, the weather report showed another storm system approaching. Bigger than the last. Heavy rainfall expected, flash flood warnings already issued. I checked my sump pump again, double-checked the backup generator, and sat back, ready. Karen, I suspected, had spent more time printing flyers than preparing her house. Sure enough, when the storm hit, it was brutal. Sheets of water poured from the sky, drumming so loud it drowned out the TV. Lightning lit up the neighborhood like daylight, revealing rivers of runoff coursing down Karen's driveway. Her attempts at makeshift barriers, sandbags, towels, even trash bags taped to her basement windows, were laughably insufficient. By midnight, water surged over them as if they weren't even there. From my window, I watched the disaster unfold. Her husband, soaked to the bone, tried to rig a shop vac hose out the window, but the machine sputtered and died within minutes. Karen, visor still clinging defiantly to her head, screamed at him to keep trying, while she stood under an umbrella that kept flipping inside out. The whole scene looked like slapstick theater, if slapstick theater also smelled like raw sewage and mildew. By 2 a.m, her basement was gone. Water sloshed against the windows, rising higher. Electrical sparks flashed once, then the house went dark. The Titanic had struck the iceberg. I almost expected to hear a violin quartet on her porch. She ran across the street around 3 a.m., pounding on my door again. This time, she was sobbing, mascara-streaked, rain plastering her hair. Please, she gasped, you have to help us. The pumps aren't working. The water's too high. We'll lose everything. I looked at her for a long moment. The same woman who had cut off my water, slandered me, tried to weaponize the HOA, now begging me for salvation. I opened the door just enough to lean against the frame. Karen, you've spent weeks trying to ruin me. Why would I help you now? Her eyes darted wildly, desperation overtaking pride. Because we're neighbors. Because it's the right thing to do. I shook my head slowly. The right thing would have been to mind your own business. And I closed the door. Through the rain, I saw her collapse against her husband, sobbing, before they stumbled back across the flooded street. Minutes later, emergency lights flashed again as the fire truck pulled up for the second time in 2 weeks. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving destruction in its wake. Karen's basement was submerged, her furniture floating, drywall peeling. Her once immaculate house now smelled like a swamp. Neighbors stood at a distance, whispering, shaking their heads. She had lost the battle, the war, and her credibility in one final collapse. And me? I poured a glass of clear, cold water from my faucet, took a long sip, and thought about how sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply standing back and letting someone drown in the consequences they created. The storm had passed, but Karen's drama was just warming up. When the fire department left that second night, leaving behind industrial fans and a trail of muddy footprints, her house looked less like a suburban dream home and more like a crime scene. You could smell it from across the street, a pungent mix of sewage, mildew, and wet carpet, the kind of smell that seeps into drywall and clings forever. The next morning, as I took out the trash, I noticed her pacing on her porch, phone glued to her ear. She wasn't wearing her usual smug visor, probably still drying on a radiator somewhere, but she had the same restless energy of a queen about to lose her throne. Her voice carried across the street in the crisp morning air. "I don't care what it costs. Send someone immediately. This is an emergency. The insurance company can bill me later." By noon, 2 men in polos and khakis showed up, lugging clipboards and cameras. Adjusters. They walked the perimeter of her house, snapped photos of the foundation, peered through basement windows fogged with condensation, and whispered to each other in the kind of low tones that never mean good news. Karen followed them like a shadow, gesturing wildly at my side of the street, pointing at my rain barrels, clearly spinning her conspiracy theory for anyone who would listen. One of the adjusters eventually raised a hand. "Ma'am, with respect, this looks like a drainage issue on your property. Not covered." Karen's face twisted in outrage. "Not covered? My basement is destroyed. My furniture is floating. My son's childhood trophies are waterlogged. This is thousands of dollars of damage." The adjuster sighed. "Your policy doesn't include flood coverage. We can document this, but unless you have a rider for groundwater, you'll be responsible." For a moment, Karen just stood there, mouth open, visor hair sticking to her forehead in frizzed strands. Then she turned, finger jabbing toward me. "It's his fault. His illegal water storage redirected the storm. He caused this. He owes me compensation." The adjuster glanced at me, then back at her. His expression was neutral, professional, but his silence spoke volumes. Without another word, they packed up their cameras and left, leaving Karen on her porch screaming after them. That afternoon, the city inspector's truck pulled up again. The same 2 men from before, this time with official paperwork in hand. They didn't even bother humoring her theatrics. One handed her a notice of violation, the other pointed to the curb box she had so lovingly vandalized weeks earlier. "Tampering with municipal property," he said flatly. "You've been fined. Failure to pay will result in legal escalation." Karen's shriek could have peeled paint. She chased them down the driveway, waving her arms like a windmill caught in a tornado. "I'm the victim. You should be fining him. Arrest him. He's poisoned this whole neighborhood with his barrels." The inspectors didn't bother responding. They drove off, leaving Karen in the rain-stained driveway, waving her violation notice like a flag of war. The neighbors were no longer silent. By evening, I heard the chatter. Mrs. Alvarez, 2 doors down, told Mike she was tired of the mildew stink drifting into her garden. A couple of parents whispered about property values dropping because of Karen's flooded mess. Someone even posted anonymously on the neighborhood Facebook group, "Maybe it's time we elected a new compliance officer. Some people clearly can't handle the responsibility." The post racked up likes. Karen must have seen it too, because the next morning she was back on the offensive. Flyers. Again. Only this time, they weren't about me. They were pleas for donations. "Save the Benson home," they read, complete with dramatic photos of her soggy basement, a broken lamp half submerged, a stuffed animal floating like roadkill. She claimed the HOA was morally obligated to pitch in. No one did. The only thing her flyers accomplished was making her the butt of more jokes. Mike taped one to his barbecue grill with the caption, "Basement sale, water damage discounts." Another neighbor slipped one into his dog's waste bag dispenser. Her pride couldn't handle it. That evening, she knocked on my door again. Not screaming this time, not shrieking, just simmering. Her eyes were red, her clothes smelled faintly of mildew. "You'll regret this," she said in a low voice. "I'll make sure of it." I tilted my head. "Regret what, Karen? Owning rain barrels? Drinking water without your permission?" She clenched her fists. "You think you've won. You think everyone's laughing at me. But I have connections. I know people. You'll see." And with that, she stomped off, muttering threats under her breath. Her connections, as it turned out, were laughable. The following day, she filed a small claims lawsuit against me. I got the notice in the mail, alleging that I had diverted rainfall and illegally collected municipal resources, causing her basement flood. I almost laughed myself to tears reading it. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. But in the meantime, nature wasn't finished with her. Another round of storms rolled in. Not as brutal as the Titanic storm, but heavy enough to saturate the already weakened ground around her foundation. Her sump pump, fried in the last flood, hadn't been replaced. And once again, her basement filled like a swimming pool. By now, the neighborhood didn't even pretend to be sympathetic. People stood on porches with coffee mugs, watching the spectacle unfold. Kids splashed in puddles near her yard, giggling at the sight of her husband trying to drag soggy boxes out of the garage. Karen screamed at them to stop, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of rainfall. The second flood sealed her fate. Insurance wouldn't touch her. The city had fined her. The HOA board was distancing themselves, refusing to back her theatrics, and her neighbors, once too polite to challenge her, were openly mocking her. Still, she wouldn't quit. At the rescheduled HOA meeting, she showed up with her binder of fake statutes, her voice trembling with rage. If this community won't defend me, then you're all complicit. Every one of you. Don't come crying to me when your basements flood because of his criminal barrels. Harold sighed, then stood. Karen, we're holding a vote. Effective immediately, you're removed from the compliance committee. The vote wasn't even close. Only her husband raised his hand in her defense, and even he looked like he regretted it. The rest of the neighbors, tired of her antics, ousted her in a single motion. Her scream of outrage echoed across the garage. You can't do this. I am the HOA. But she wasn't. Not anymore. By the time I walked home that evening, the air felt lighter. Neighbors waved, some even thanked me quietly for finally shutting her down. I hadn't done a thing, really. I just let her do what she always did. Take control, overreach, and then collapse under the weight of her own ego. Her basement was still a swamp. Her finances were drying up as fast as her credibility. And her lawsuit? Well, that was still on the calendar. I almost looked forward to it, if only to watch her try to convince a judge that my barrels controlled the weather. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood polish and cheap coffee, the kind of scent that clings to bureaucratic buildings no matter how often they're scrubbed. I sat on a bench in the hallway, hands folded, waiting for the inevitable circus. The lawsuit Karen had filed against me had finally made it to a hearing. Small claims court. Low stakes, low glamour, but high entertainment value when your opponent was a woman who believed rainwater could be stolen like cable TV. She arrived late, of course, sweeping in with a stack of binders clutched to her chest like sacred text. Her husband trailed behind, shoulders sagging, carrying a tote bag that looked suspiciously like it had been fished out of their still damp basement. Karen wore her usual uniform. Visor perched proudly, yoga pants stretched taut, and an expression of righteousness that could power a city grid. When she spotted me sitting calmly on the bench, sipping from a bottle of water, her face tightened into a sneer. "You won't be smiling after today," she hissed as she marched past. I smiled wider. "Karen, if I stop smiling now, I'll miss the show." Inside the courtroom, the judge, a weary man with the look of someone who had seen too many petty squabbles over fence lines and noise complaints, called the case. Karen launched into her opening statement with the fervor of a prosecutor in a prime-time drama. She accused me of diverting rainfall, tampering with hydrological balances, and illegally collecting municipal water without a permit. Each accusation was punctuated with her slamming a binder onto the table, the echo reverberating through the small chamber. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Municipal water?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said, nodding emphatically. "Rainwater is part of the municipal supply. By hoarding it, he deprived others, and his reckless barrels caused catastrophic flooding of my property." The courtroom was silent for a beat. Then the judge leaned forward. "Ma'am, are you suggesting your neighbor controls the weather?" Karen hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Well, not controls exactly, but he manipulates it. He has created artificial currents. It's science. It was my turn. I stood, calm and deliberate, and slid a USB stick across to the clerk. Your Honor, I'd like to submit video evidence. The footage played on the courtroom monitor. Karen, crouched by my curb box at midnight, pliers in hand, muttering about justice for the neighborhood, while shutting off my water. Her own voice filled the chamber. Gasps rippled from the few onlookers in the back. Neighbors who had come for moral support, or maybe just free entertainment. Karen leapt to her feet. That's doctored. Deepfakes. Lies. The judge held up a hand. Sit down, ma'am. He turned to me. Do you have anything else? Just this, I said, handing over her cease and desist letter. A document she delivered to my mailbox, citing statutes that don't exist. It accuses me of stealing rain and threatens litigation under federal law. The judge skimmed it, sighed, and set it down. Ma'am, this is nonsense. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to recover. But my basement. My property is ruined. Someone has to pay. The judge leaned back, folding his hands. Your basement flooded because of inadequate drainage and your own tampering with municipal utilities. Not because your neighbor owns rain barrels. Case dismissed. The gavel's crack was sharp, final, and devastating for her. She stood frozen for a moment, as though waiting for the judge to take it back. When he didn't, she whirled on me, eyes blazing. This isn't over, she hissed. But it was. Outside the courtroom, the neighbors who had come to watch couldn't hold back. Mike clapped me on the back, laughing. Man, you didn't even have to say much. She did all the work for you. Denise, the treasurer, shook her head in disbelief. I've sat through years of HOA meetings with that woman. Watching her implode in front of a judge? Worth every second. Karen, meanwhile, stormed out to the parking lot, binder papers flying in the wind, her husband scrambling to catch them. She shouted something about appeals, about conspiracies, about how the entire system was rigged. No one listened. Word spread fast. By evening, the neighborhood Facebook group was buzzing. Someone posted a meme of Noah's Ark with the caption, Karen's new basement plan. Another edited her cease and desist letter to read, cease raining immediately or face fines. The laughter was merciless. For someone who had built her identity on control, this was annihilation. The final blow came not from me, not from the HOA, not even from the city, but from her own house. 2 weeks later, another storm rolled through. Not as bad as the Titanic storm, but enough to test her already weakened foundation. The water came back, seeping through cracks, flooding the same basement that had barely dried. By now, she had no insurance coverage, no money left for repairs, and no credibility with the HOA. That night, as water crept up her basement walls again, she snapped. Neighbors later told me they saw her dragging soggy furniture out onto the lawn, screaming at the sky, visor askew, accusing God himself of collusion. Her husband just stood there, silent, holding an umbrella over himself while she melted down in the rain. It was the climax no one asked for but everyone secretly wanted. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, reduced to shouting at clouds while her house drowned. The next morning, a moving truck appeared. Not hers, her husband's. He loaded up his things quietly, mechanically, without a word. By afternoon, he was gone. She stood on the porch, alone, clutching her visor like a crown she refused to surrender. But her kingdom was already lost. The HOA board voted her out permanently the following week. Notices went up. She was banned from any position of authority, barred from sending flyers, stripped of her so-called power. Her basement remained uninhabitable, her finances in ruins, her husband gone. She was a queen without a court, shouting into the void. And me? I went about my life. Water pressure steady, barrels full, grass green. I waved to neighbors who smiled back, free from the reign of terror. I even joked once at an HOA meeting, Let's make sure we don't outlaw clouds next." The room erupted in laughter. Karen avoided me after that, skulking in and out of her house like a ghost. Sometimes I'd catch her staring from behind her blinds, eyes burning with resentment. But she never spoke to me again. Not one word. In the end, I didn't need revenge. Nature had handled it better than I ever could. Her arrogance, her need for control, her obsession with power, it had all backfired spectacularly. Her basement had become a metaphor for her entire life. Sinking, rotten, impossible to salvage. And me? I just kept sipping my water. Clear, cold, and utterly satisfying.